My big sister is perfect wife for you. Please take care of us both. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Rowan Pike came riding into town in the late afternoon. He didn't look like someone who wanted to be noticed. His horse was worn for miles, his old cavalry coat stained at the cuffs, and the scar along his jaw cut through a face that had seen too much for 30 years. He had served as a scout during the war and stayed on in uniform until he couldn't stomach orders anymore. Since then, he had drifted between army posts, cattle outfits, and the edge of nowhere, taking just enough work to keep moving. This town was no different to him. He planned only to buy a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, maybe some nails. Then he would ride back out toward his cabin a half-day north, the place he used when the weather turned bad. He had learned not to tie himself to people or towns. Belonging always led to loss, and loss was something he'd carried enough of. But as his horse clopped down the main street, something unexpected happened. A small hand tugged hard at his coat sleeve. Rowan looked down. A little girl, barefoot on the packed dirt road, stood staring up at him. Her dress was patched thin, her hair tangled, her cheeks hollow from hunger. Her voice wavered but stayed strong. "Mister," she said, "my big sister is perfect for you. Please take her and me with you." Rowan blinked. He wasn't sure he'd heard right. His first thought was that some drunk was playing a joke, but then he saw the way the girl's hand shook while holding on to him. She was serious, dead serious. He followed her gaze to the hitch rail in front of the mercantile. That's when he saw Mara Dawson. She looked older than her 25 years, though it wasn't age so much as hard weeks that had carved themselves into her face. Her dress was torn across the neckline, seams fraying so badly she kept an arm folded over her chest. Her skin was bronze from labor in the fields, her dark hair falling loose around bruises that hadn't fully healed. She held herself stiff, proud, even while men on the porch leaned against posts and stared at her like she was already sold. Rowan's gut tightened. He didn't ask why her dress was torn. He didn't need to. He had seen that look before. Women left with no protection, forced to stand ground they shouldn't have had to stand. The girl tugged his coat again. "Please, our parents died. Fever took them. The folks here, they say we owe for wood, for medicine. They want us to pay with work." Her lip quivered, but she kept her chin up. "We don't want to stay." Rowan's jaw clenched. He had come for supplies. Nothing more. He had promised himself never to take on burdens he couldn't carry. But the girl's voice dug into him. She wasn't asking for coins, or bread, or pity. She was asking for safety. Asking for him. The men on the porch snickered. One called out, "You want her drifter? Take her. That's on her anyway." Girl too. Rowan turned his head slowly toward the sound. His expression didn't change, but the porch went quiet all the same. He had that kind of face, scarred, steady, the kind that told men when to stop. He swung a leg over and dropped from the saddle, dust crunching under his boots. His horse shifted but stayed calm. Rowan crouched slightly to meet the girl's eyes. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low. "Lottie," she said. "And she's Mara. She's all I have." Rowan nodded once. His thoughts pressed against him like weight. He could walk away. It wasn't his fight. But if he did, the porch men would take them before sundown. He knew that with certainty. He also knew he wouldn't sleep a night in peace if he left. His decision formed in silence. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a strip of jerky, and put in Lottie's hand. Then he straightened, walked to Mara, and held out his coat. She hesitated, her eyes flashing between suspicion and shame, then slowly pulled it over her shoulders. She stood taller once covered. Rowan took Lottie by the waist, lifted her onto the saddle, and guided Mara to climb up behind. He swung up last, the horse shifting under the added weight. Without a word to the men watching, he turned the reins. The sound of hooves on hard ground carried down Main Street. Dust rose behind them, swallowing the porch laughter until it faded into silence. Rowan Pike hadn't planned to bring anyone back with him, but he knew before they reached the edge of town that the girl and her sister would not be left behind. And though he did not show it on his face, inside he felt the old unease of a man who had just broken his own vow. Never belong, never stay, never let anyone lean on him again. Now 2 strangers leaned on him completely. Rowan Pike led the horse north out of town, with both sisters riding double behind him. And though he said little, the weight of what he had done pressed hard in his chest. The town shrank in the dust behind them, the laughter of men on the porch still echoing in his mind. He had chosen, and now he had to live with it. The trail cut through low hills, scrub brush, and bare cottonwoods that rattled in the wind. Rowan's horse moved slow under 3 riders, but he didn't push it. He glanced back once and saw Lottie leaning against Mara, chewing at the strip of jerky he had given her. Her small hands clutched at her sister's torn dress, her eyes half closed from exhaustion. Mara sat straight despite the weight of her sister, Rowan's old cavalry coat drawn across her shoulders. She avoided his eyes when he looked at her, but he could see her knuckles white against the saddle horn. After a long silence, Mara finally spoke. Her voice was tired, rough. "Why did you stop?" "You didn't have to." Rowan's reply came flat, almost guarded. "Didn't feel right leaving you there." She gave a bitter little breath, not quite a laugh. "Nothing's felt right since our parents died. They owed money, and when they were buried, it fell on me. The widow Clark said she'd keep us, but all she wanted was work for her table. I tried, but the men kept coming, looking, talking. She didn't stop them." Mara's hand tugged the coat tighter. "When I said no, she told me we'd pay another way. Said the town had claim to us. That's when Lottie pulled me into the street. Then you came." Rowan's jaw clenched. He had suspected as much, but hearing it stripped away any doubt. He didn't answer. He never had words for such things. Instead, he adjusted his reins and guided the horse up a narrow path between 2 ridges, the one that led to his place. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had settled in. It stood small and square at the edge of cottonwoods, smoke hole above the roof patched with tin, a lean-to shed, and a half-fallen garden fence showing where summer had ended. The creek behind it ran cold and steady. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it was away from eyes that judged. Rowan dismounted, lifted Lottie down, then offered a steadying hand to Mara. She hesitated but took it. Her palm was warm, calloused, trembling faintly. She let go as soon as her feet touched the ground. He unlatched the cabin door and pushed it open. The room smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and dry beans. Inside was a narrow bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a stove in the corner, shelves lined with tins and tools. Not a home for 3, but it was something. "You'll take the bed," Rowan said. "I'll keep the fire and sleep here." Mara stepped in, her eyes moving over everything. The cracked window, the rifle hanging on pegs, the folded blanket on the chair. She nodded once. "It's more than we had." Lottie padded and barefoot, staring at the shelves like they were treasure. She touched the worn spines of a few books, then pointed. "Do you read them?" Rowan cleared his throat. "Sometimes." Truth was not much. He had carried them from post to post, never throwing them out, though the words often blurred when he tried. But it seemed to matter to the girl, so he left it there. He set a pot on the stove, poured in beans from a sack, and ladled water from the bucket. While they warmed, he dug into a chest and pulled out clean socks, setting them in front of Lottie. "Put those on," he said. "Floor's cold." The girl's eyes widened. She pulled them over her small feet, grinning for the first time. Mara watched quietly, her lips pressed tight, and Rowan noticed her shoulders loosen just a little. They ate together at the table, beans and old cornbread he had left from 2 nights before. Mara cut her portion smaller to give Lottie more, pushing food across the tin plate without being asked. Rowan watched her do it, the way she bent her head to hide the act, and felt something stir inside him. A mix of anger at what she'd been reduced to and respect for the strength it took to keep dignity in scraps. After supper, Lottie dozed at the table, her head drooping until Mara carried her carefully to the bed. Rowan pulled a blanket over her. He stepped outside to give them space, sitting on the stoop, listening to the creak and the wind in the trees. He thought about his decision, about how quick it had come. He told himself he could take them to another town if he needed to. But the truth pressed heavier. He knew already he wouldn't. When he came back in, Mara was standing near the stove. She had washed fast behind the blanket he had strung as a divider. Her hair was damp, her cheeks flushed from the heat, his coat still pulled close around her shoulders. Her torn dress hung cleaner now, but the neckline still slipped low, and she adjusted it quickly. Rowan set a tin of salve on the table. "For bruises," he said. Mara's eyes flicked up to his. For the first time, they held steady. There was caution in them still, but also something else, something like the faintest breath of trust. She nodded. The fire popped. The cabin settled into quiet. Rowan lay down by the hearth with his rifle propped beside him, Mara on the bed with Lottie curled close. He stared at the ceiling beams, listening to the two sets of breathing behind him. He had spent years swearing never to let anyone near. Tonight, he was already breaking that vow. He told himself it was just for the night. Deep down, he knew better. Morning came with a gray sky and a hard chill in the air. Rowan woke before dawn, as he always did, the fire only embers at his side. For a moment, he lay still, listening. The cabin was quiet except for the soft breathing of Mara and Lottie on the bed. He could hear the girl murmur, once in her sleep, then settle back into silence. The sound felt strange in the room. He was used to hearing only the crackle of wood and the creak of the roof. He pushed himself up, set logs on the fire, and stepped outside. The ground was hard, the air sharp in his lungs. His horse stood tethered to the post, shifting and snorting. Rowan rubbed its neck, his mind heavy with questions he hadn't answered the night before. He had brought the sisters here, but now what? He wasn't a man meant for raising children or keeping house. He had built this cabin for quiet, not for a family. Still, he had made the choice, and he knew deep down he wouldn't undo it. When he came back inside, Mara was already awake, standing at the table, pulling her hair back with a strip torn from the hem of her dress. His coat was folded neatly on the chair. The torn calico still clung to her, the neckline loose, seams straining where they had given way. She straightened when she saw him. "You don't keep much," she said, her eyes moving over the shelves. "Just what you need." "That's enough for me," Rowan answered, setting the water bucket on the stove to heat. Mara's voice was steady, but carried an edge. "What is it you do out here?" Rowan paused. He hadn't told her yet, and he could see the question had been on her mind since the ride. "I was an Army scout," he said finally. "After the war, I stayed on a while. Then I left. Didn't want orders anymore. I take odd work, mending fences, guiding wagon trains, sometimes hunting. Mostly I keep to myself." He stirred the water with the dipper. "This place is just far enough from town. I wanted it quiet." Mara nodded slowly. She looked around again, as if taking measure of whether this man could truly keep her and her sister safe. "Quiet's worth something," she said under her breath. Lottie stirred and sat up on the bed, blinking in the dim light. She rubbed her eyes with her fists, then looked around as if not sure she was still here. Her gaze landed on the socks Rowan had given her, still warm on her feet. She smiled faintly, and Rowan felt something tighten in his chest he couldn't name. Breakfast was plain, biscuits from Mara's hand and beans left from the pot. She cut them small for Lottie, who ate hungrily but kept glancing between Rowan and her sister as if trying to measure this new life. Afterward, Rowan stepped outside to split wood, his axe biting into logs, the rhythm steady. Lottie followed him, carrying small pieces of kindling with both arms, determined to help. He showed her where to stack them, not saying much, but he nodded when she set them right. The girl's pride at his approval was clear, and Mara, watching from the doorway, let her shoulders ease for the first time in days. Inside, Mara set herself to work. She scrubbed the cookpot clean at the water trough, swept the dirt floor, and began ordering the shelves. Her movements were purposeful, almost fierce, like she needed to prove she wasn't just a burden he had dragged home. Rowan noticed. Every time he stepped inside for wood or water, he saw how she bent to the work, her torn dress clinging tighter with each motion, hair falling loose from its tie. She never asked for help, never asked for permission. That evening, Rowan pulled out a small wooden box from a shelf. Inside were needles, thread, and scraps of old shirts he had kept. He set them on the table. "Give me your dress," he said. Mara's head snapped up, suspicious, until he added, "I'll mend the seam. Can't have it falling apart on you." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, carefully, She pulled the coat tighter and slipped the garment over her shoulders, laying it on the table. The torn neckline and frayed bodice gaped under the lamplight. Rowan sat, bent over the cloth, his big hands steady as he threaded the needle. He stitched slow and careful, tugging fabric back together, covering the gaps. He could feel Mara's eyes on him as he worked. He wondered if she thought about what it meant, his hands fixing what others had torn. When he tied off the last stitch, he glanced up. Mara was standing close, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to," she said. Rowan held her gaze. "You needed it." For the first time, a faint flush rose on her cheeks. She took the dress, ran her fingers along the seam, and said quietly, "Thank you." That night, Lottie curled small on the bed under blankets while Mara lay beside her in the mended dress, her breathing slow and even. Rowan stretched out by the fire again, staring at the rafters. His thoughts kept circling the same truth. He had planned to buy supplies and ride back to Solitude. Now he had a woman and child under his roof. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but for the first time in years, he felt the silence of the cabin was not just his anymore. The following evening, the cabin felt warmer, not only from the fire, but from the way the three of them had begun to settle into a rhythm. Rowan had spent the day mending the fence line, showing Lottie how to carry nails in a tin and hand them up, while Mara had washed what clothes they had and tried to put the room in better order. By nightfall, the beans were cooked again, and the girl had fallen asleep at the table with her head against her folded arms, crumbs clinging to her cheek. Rowan watched Mara carry Lottie gently to the bed, tucking her in with a mother's care, though she was only a sister. He noticed how careful her hands were, how she kept brushing the girl's hair back like it was her way of calming herself, too. When Mara stood again, her eyes shifted to the mended bodice of her dress, the new seam visible in the lamplight. It held better now, not gaping open like before, though the neckline still sat low. She walked back to the table and laid her fingers against the cloth. "You're good with your hands," she said softly. Rowan looked at her, unsure what to do with the words. "Had to learn," he muttered. "Army doesn't hand you new gear when it tears. You fix what you've got." Mara drew the chair opposite him, her movements cautious but steady. "Why did you leave the army?" she asked. It was the question she hadn't dared to voice until now. Rowan leaned back, jaw tightening. He considered brushing it off, but something in her eyes, direct, steady, made him answer. "Because I was tired of being told who to follow and who to fight. Lost too many men I rode with. Saw too many things I can't forget. I wanted quiet. That's why I built this place." Mara nodded, her lips pressed thin. She seemed to weigh his words against her own past. "Quiet's what I prayed for too. But quiet doesn't come easy when folks decide you're theirs to use." Her voice caught, just once before she steadied it. Rowan shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with her pain, yet unwilling to look away from it. His eyes fell on the fading bruises still visible at her collarbone. He reached for the tin of salve he had left on the shelf and pushed it across the table. "For those," he said. "It helps." She stared at the tin, then at him. Slowly, she stood and came around the table. She placed it back in his hand and said, "Not just me. You carry scars too." She let her eyes flick to the old wound across his jaw. He swallowed hard, but he didn't stop her when she reached for his face. Her fingers were gentle, tracing the line of the scar. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not anymore," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Her hand lingered, and for the first time in years, Rowan felt seen in a way that wasn't about fear or respect. It was about care. Mara's thumb brushed his cheek, and the space between them grew smaller. She leaned in, hesitated for a heartbeat, then pressed her lips to his. It was soft, uncertain, but real. Rowan didn't move at first, letting her choose. When she leaned in again, firmer this time, he let his hand rise to her waist, steady but not pulling. He kissed her back, slow and sure, the warmth of her body against his. When a moment broke, Mara pulled back just enough to breathe. She looked at him, searching his face. "I don't want to be someone's burden. Not yours. Not anyone's." "You're not," Rowan said. His tone carried no hesitation, only truth. She studied him, then nodded once, as if she needed the words anchored in her. After a pause, she sat him down in the chair, opened the salve and dipped her fingers in. She touched his shoulder where the shirt pulled tight, working the ointment into old knots of muscle left by years of war and trail life. Rowan sat still, his breath controlled, though the closeness tested his restraint. The smell of salve mixed with the heat of the fire, and her loose hair brushed against his cheek as she leaned closer. When she finished, she lingered a moment, her forehead nearly resting against his. Then she stood, placed the tin on the shelf, and walked quietly to the bed where Lottie slept. She lay down beside her sister, pulling the blanket over them both. Rowan stayed in the chair a long while, staring into the fire. He had not meant for it to happen, any of it, but he could no longer deny it. They were no longer strangers sharing cabin. They were something closer, something that carried a weight heavier than loneliness, yet far easier to bear. The next morning, Rowan rose early again, though this time he wasn't alone in the work. Mara was already up, standing at the stove with her hair pulled into a rough braid, sleeves rolled high, and the mended dress holding together better than before. The fire cast light over her face, softening the exhaustion in her eyes. She didn't look like a guest anymore. She looked like she belonged to the place. Rowan noticed the way she had tidied the room overnight. Tools gathered neatly in the corner, blankets folded, shelves ordered so the food stores looked fuller than they were. He had lived in the cabin for years without caring how it looked. Now, with her touch, it felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Breakfast was simple. Corn cakes she had managed from what little flour was left. Lottie sat at the table, swinging her legs, smiling faintly when Rowan set his tin cup in front of her with water. She asked questions between bites, one she hadn't dared ask before. "Do you have a wife, Mr. Rowan?" "No." His answer was short, certain. "Family," she pressed. "Not anymore." The girl looked down at her plate, as if she understood more than her age should allow. Mara gave Rowan a quick look, as though she wanted to ask more too, but didn't. After breakfast, Rowan pulled on his coat and set to work splitting logs outside. Lottie insisted on helping, carrying kindling from the pile to the stack, her bare feet thumping on the ground. Rowan handed her small pieces he had already cut, showing her how to line them straight. She listened closely, eager to prove herself. When she got it right, he nodded once. That single gesture lit her face with pride. Inside, Mara took charge of the cabin. She scrubbed the pot, rinsed clothes in the creek, and worked at the garden plot. The soil was hard, stalks from the past season still sticking up, but she bent to it with determination, pulling weeds and turning earth with the short-handled hoe Rowan had left leaning against the fence. Sweat gathered at her neck, darkening the fabric at her chest, and strands of hair escaped the braid, falling loose. Rowan noticed when he came to check the fence line, though he didn't let himself stare long. By midday, he had fetched nails and hammered new boards into place along the chicken coop. Mara joined him, handing boards when he needed them, Lottie chasing the few scrawny hens that still pecked around. Mara's skirt brushed against his arm once as she stepped close to steady a plank. Neither of them spoke about it, but both felt it. That evening, when the sun dropped low and the sky burned pale, they ate together again. Lottie leaned against Rowan this time, half asleep before the plate was cleared. Mara carried her to the bed and tucked her in, then stayed standing a moment, watching Rowan from across the small cabin. "You didn't tell me before," Mara said quietly. "Why you came to this territory at all? Why here?" Rowan set his fork down, rubbing a hand across his jaw. He considered whether to answer. "I wanted somewhere no one asked questions. After the war, after leaving the army, I didn't have anywhere else to be. I had enough coin to buy land, enough hands to build walls. That was all." Mara's expression softened, though her voice stayed steady. "Then why didn't you just ride past us in town?" Rowan's eyes met hers. He didn't look away. "Because I've seen what happens when men stand by. I couldn't do it again." Silence settled heavy between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mara stepped closer to the table, resting her hands on the back of the chair opposite him. Her eyes held as a moment longer. Then she nodded, as if she had heard what she needed. When the fire dimmed, Rowan lay down near the hearth again, though he stayed awake longer than usual. Mara's breathing filled the cabin, soft, and even as she slept beside her sister. He thought of a vow he had made years ago, not to carry anyone else's weight. And yet, the small girl's trust, Mara's steady resilience, the quiet rhythm of the day, they had already bound themselves to him without asking permission. As sleep finally took him, Rowan realized the question wasn't whether they belonged in his cabin anymore. The question was how long he could go on pretending he didn't need them as much as they needed him. The days that followed carried a rhythm almost steady, enough that Rowan started to believe the sisters could stay without the outside world prying in. Mara kept the cabin ordered, cooking meals from scraps he never bothered with before, mending not only her own dress, but even patching one of his old shirts so it sat better on his shoulders. Lottie followed Rowan on short trips to the creek, asking questions he usually avoided, though he answered her more than he expected. It was almost beginning to feel like a household. But Rowan had lived long enough to know peace never held forever. It was late afternoon when he first saw the rider. The man came slow up the track, a brown coat drawn tight, hat low. Rowan stepped out onto the porch before the horse reached the gate. Mara appeared behind him in the doorway, her face tight with unease, Lottie clinging to her skirt. The rider stopped at the fence post and hammered a folded paper to the wood. Ledger says Dawson's sisters owe the widow Clark for lodging, food, and medicine, the man said, voice flat. Claim of indenture. Belongs to the town until paid. Rowan stood on the porch steps, arms at his sides. That debt's done. The man smirked, but his eyes flicked wary at Rowan's scarred jaw and broad shoulders. Debt's never done when the widow says otherwise. Paper here makes it law. He tapped the post once, then turned his horse without another word. Dust rose behind him as he rode back toward town. Rowan walked to the fence, pulled the paper free, and read it. The words were plain. Mara and Lottie bound to service until debt cleared. He folded it once, walked inside, and without a word set it in the stove fire. The flames curled it black until it turned to ash. Mara stood watching, her hands gripping the edge of the table. What if they come back? She asked. They will, Rowan said, but I'll settle it. The next morning, he saddled his horse. Mara started to speak, then stopped, her jaw tight. She knew better than to argue. She could see he had already decided. Rowan rode into town. The air, there was different, heavy with the stares of men who remembered the day he had taken the sisters away. He tied his horse at the mercantile and stepped inside. The room went quiet. He walked to the counter. I'm paying what's owed, he said. He laid down silver from the pouch he kept for seasons of work, more than what the paper had claimed. This closes all business. The clerk hesitated, then scribbled a receipt. One of the men near the stove spat and muttered, Paper don't change property, drifter. You can't buy what belongs. Rowan turned his head. He said nothing, but the silence stretched long, and when his eyes fixed on the man's, the other looked away. Rowan picked up the receipt, folded it into his coat, and left. He had no taste for more words. Back at the cabin, the clouds had gathered heavy, and rain began to fall. Rowan handed Mara the folded slip. Paid in full. Her fingers shook when she opened it. She read the clerk's mark, then folded it again and pressed it to her chest. I didn't think anyone would ever clear it, she said quietly. You're free of them, Rowan answered. Thunder rolled. Water began seeping through a gap in the cabin roof. Rowan pulled out a ladder, set it under the drip, and climbed. Mara came out despite the rain, steadying the ladder as he hammered a new shingle into place. The rain plastered her hair to her face, her dress clinging close to her curves, but she didn't flinch from the storm. When he climbed down, she was laughing, just a short breath, the first sound of its kind he had heard from her. A drop of water slid down her nose, and she brushed it away, cheeks flushed. Inside, with the roof patched and the storm pressing against the walls, the three of them crowded near the fire. Rowan set his rifle by the door, Mara stirred stew, and Lottie leaned against her sister's hip. The room felt tighter, warmer, alive in a way Rowan hadn't known in years. Later, when Lottie fell asleep against Mara's lap, Rowan sat across the table. Mara met his eyes, the lamplight showing the mended seam of her bodice, the neckline still low but neat. She studied him a long moment, then said, "You've already done more for us than anyone else ever tried." "I don't know why." Rowan looked back at her, his voice low and certain. "Because no one should own you." The storm rattled against the cabin, but inside it was steady. For the first time, Mara's shoulders eased. Rowan knew the fight with Town wasn't finished, but he also knew he wouldn't let them take another step near her or Lottie. Not while he drew breath. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the air damp and sharp, but the cabin carried a new tension. Lottie was pale at breakfast, pushing her food around without eating. Mara bent to feel her forehead and froze. The heat under her skin told the story at once. Rowan saw Mara's lips tighten, the fear breaking through her usual composure. "She's burning," Mara whispered. Rowan touched the girl's wrist, counting her pulse the way he had learned in the field. It raced beneath his fingers. He set down his tin cup, grabbed his coat, and spoke firmly. "I'll get what she needs. Willow bark. Herbs. There's a trapper 2 miles off." Mara stood, voice shaking. "Don't be long." The ride was hard through mud-slick trails, but Rowan pressed his horse, his jaw locked against the worry rising inside him. He had seen fever take men faster than bullets. The image of the girl's small hand tugging at his sleeve in town burned in his mind. How steady she had been, how certain, and he swore he would not let her be lost now. At the trapper's cabin, he traded shot and tobacco for willow bark, dried herbs, and instructions. Then he turned back fast as the horse would run. When he returned, Mara was at the bedside, hair falling loose, damp cloth pressed to Lottie's face. The girl stirred and muttered in delirium, her breath quick and shallow. Rowan dropped the bundle on the table, set water to boil, and began mixing as the trapper had told him. His hands worked steady, though inside he felt the old helplessness of watching men die on cots. Through the night, they sat in shifts, one holding the girl, the other tending the fire and steeping more willow tea. Mara's hands trembled as she wiped sweat from her sister's brow. "I can't lose her too," she whispered, voice breaking. "First our parents, then her. I can't." Rowan pressed her shoulder, firm and certain. "She'll pull through." When Mara looked at him, eyes wet, he added quietly, "I've seen worse fever break." Hours dragged. The storm outside gave way to stillness. The only sounds inside the cabin Lottie's ragged breaths and the pop of the fire. Rowan watched Mara as much as he watched the girl. She hadn't left Lottie's side, whispering words of comfort even when the child was too far gone to hear. Her strength was the kind he recognized, the kind that came only when there was no other choice. Near dawn, the heat finally eased. Lottie's breathing slowed and her skin cooled. She stirred, asking faintly for water. Mara nearly collapsed in relief, tears falling freely as she lifted her sister's head to sip from the cup. Rowan exhaled for the first time in hours, tension draining from his shoulders. Mara leaned against him, worn out, her head on his shoulder. "I thought I'd lose her," she said. "You didn't," Rowan answered. He hesitated, then admitted more than he had before. "I lost men I called brothers. Lost them to fever, bullets, starvation. Couldn't stop it. I swore I'd never sit and watch again if I had a choice." Mara studied him through tired eyes. "And still you let us in." "I couldn't walk past," he said simply. Silence lingered between them, heavy but not empty. Mara's hand found his, resting there without force, and Rowan didn't pull away. For the first time since the war, the quiet he carried didn't feel like a burden. It felt shared. By daylight, Lottie slept peacefully, her fever broken. Mara, exhausted, lay beside her on the bed. Rowan sat in the chair by the fire, watching both sisters breathe easy at last. His mind turned to what came next, the men from town, the threats that hadn't ended with a burned paper. But as he looked at the two of them, safe in his cabin, he felt the decision already set. Whatever came, he wouldn't let anyone take them. By the next afternoon, Rowan felt the fever had truly left the girl. Lottie sat up weak but smiling, her small hands holding tight to Mara's as if afraid she might slip away again. Mara brushed the girl's hair back, the lines of exhaustion plain in her face, though relief softened her eyes. Rowan had just stepped outside to check the fence when he saw dust rising on the trail. His stomach tightened. He knew before he counted the riders what it meant. 3 men in town coats came up the track, one holding a folded paper high as if it gave him more authority than his mouth ever could. A wagon rattled behind them, rope coiled over its side. Rowan stood still at the porch, rifle resting easy across his arms but not raised. The men halted at the fence, their horses snorting. "Got claim here," the oldest barked. His voice was cracked, angry. "Widow Clark says these two belong until debt's worked off. Paper makes it law." He waved the document toward Rowan. Rowan didn't move from the porch. His voice carried calm but firm. "The debt's been paid. I've got the receipt." The man sneered. "Receipt don't erase property." He gestured toward the cabin. "Bring the women out. Best not to make it harder." Behind Rowan, the door creaked. Mara stood in the shadow of the frame, her hand resting on Lottie's shoulder. Her dress, though worn, sat straight with the stitches Rowan had made. The bruises on her face had faded, her chin lifted now. She didn't speak, but the sight of her watching from behind Rowan changed the air. Rowan stepped down from the porch. He walked slow, steady, until he reached the wagon wheel. His rifle stayed lowered, but his shoulders carried a weight that warned enough. He stopped a breath away from the oldest rider. "I went to your store, paid what was owed and more. The clerk marked it closed. You want to test that? I'll take the receipt to Fort Randall. Men, there won't look kindly on false claims." The rider's eyes shifted. His bravado slipped when Rowan's words landed, flat and certain. He tried again, voice weaker. "Law's the law." Rowan's tone did not change. "Then you know the law doesn't give you what isn't yours. Step off my ground." The silence hung long. The other two shifted uneasily in their saddles, avoiding Rowan's eyes. The oldest looked past him to Mara again, but what he saw there wasn't fear anymore. Mara's stance told its own story. She wasn't leaving, not willingly, not with them. Lottie clung to her dress but stood upright, her chin set just like her sister's. Finally, the old man snapped the reins. The wagon lurched, the rope swinging useless. The 3 turned, muttering curses under their breath, and rode back down the trail, the dust swallowing them. Rowan stood watching until the sound of wheels faded. Only then did he lower the rifle and turn. Mara still stood at the doorway, holding Lottie close. She let out a breath she had held too long. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Not if they know what's good for them," Rowan answered. He leaned the rifle against the wall, his jaw tight but steady. "I gave them one warning. That's all they'll get." For a long moment, none of them spoke. The danger had passed, but the weight of what had nearly been hung in the room. Mara stepped closer, setting her hand against Rowan's arm. Her fingers lingered longer than before. "You didn't just keep them away," she said. "You made it clear, we're not theirs anymore." Rowan met her eyes. "You were never theirs." Inside, the fire burned low, and Lottie curled against her sister, safe for now. The cabin walls felt stronger than they had the day before. Outside, the dust trail emptied into the horizon, but inside, the truth had set. No paper, no rope, no claim would ever drag them back. Rowan had made certain of it. That night, the cabin carried a stillness unlike any Rowan had known before. The air was heavy with the memory of the men who had come and been turned away, but inside the fire burned steady and warm. Rowan sat at the table with his coat still damp from the earlier rain, watching Mara as she moved about the small space. Lottie slept soundly in the bed, her breathing deep and even, no fever in her cheeks. For the first time since he had met them, Rowan felt a weight lift. The danger had not vanished from the world, but it had been beaten back from their door, and that was enough. Mara set the last of the dishes aside and straightened. She looked tired, her hair loose and falling across her shoulders, but her eyes held none of the fear that had shadowed them in town. She came to the table and sat across from him. For a long while, they said nothing, only the fire and the creek outside filling the silence. Then she asked the question she had carried since the first day. "What happens now, Rowan? You saved us. You paid what we owed. But what do you want from us?" Rowan met her eyes, steady and calm. "I don't want payment. I don't want you to leave either. I want this just as it is. He gestured to the cabin, to the bed where Lottie slept, to Mara sitting across from him. I want you here. Mara's lips trembled faintly, but she didn't look away. All my life, men only wanted one thing from me. And when I wouldn't give it, they took everything else. You've given more than anyone, and you haven't asked for anything. Her voice lowered. It makes me wonder if I can trust it. You can, Rowan said, his voice firm, not soft. I don't want to own you. I want you to stay because you choose it. The words seemed to break something in her. Mara rose from her chair, came around the table, and stopped in front of him. She reached for his hand, lifted it, and pressed it to her waist. Then I choose this, she said. Rowan stood slowly, as though afraid to move too fast and shatter the moment. Mara lifted her face, and he kissed her, steady, unhurried, with the weight of every silence they had shared since the day in town. Her body leaned into his, soft against the hardness of his chest, her hand gripping his coat as if anchoring herself. Later, when the fire had burned down to glowing coals, Mara lay beside him in his bed, her head resting against his shoulder, her breath slow and even. For the first time, she wasn't wearing his coat. She wasn't hiding behind anything. She was there by choice, and he held her with the same steady strength he had carried on battlefields, now turned to keep rather than to fight. Near dawn, the cabin shifted with the quiet steps of Lottie climbing into the bed. She curled between them, small hand reaching out to catch Rowan's fingers, her voice a whisper. Now I have a family. Mara kissed her sister's hair, eyes damp but shining. Rowan lay still, his arm across both of them, and felt the truth settle into him like solid ground. He was no longer a man drifting through places, no longer only a soldier carrying ghosts. He belonged here to them. When the sun rose, Rowan stepped outside to hitch the small plow, Mara standing in the doorway with Lottie leaning against her leg. The earth turned dark and ready under his hands, rows forming neat behind him. Lottie ran to scatter seed, laughing. Mara hung a freshly sewn dress on the line, the neckline modest but shaped the way she chose. She caught Rowan's eye across the yard, and he gave a single nod that said what neither needed to put into words. By afternoon, the cabin no longer looked like a loner's retreat, but a place where life was meant to continue. The ledger was paid, the claim burned, the men turned away. What had begun as a plea in the dust of Main Street had become something permanent. That evening, as the fire lit their faces and the three of them ate together, Mara set her hand over Rowan's on the table. She didn't speak, and neither did he. But when Lottie looked between them and smiled, it was clear the question of where they belonged no longer needed asking. In that small cabin under the cottonwoods, Rowan, Mara, and Lottie had become what none of them had dared hope for: a family. And this time, nothing and no one would take it away.